you need to connect with a person, tell them why this story is good for them. Why does this help them with a question or with a problem that they have? And if you can't do that, you're losing your audience.
Welcome to the Storycraft podcast for storytellers. I'm your host, Meg Adams, and I'm here to help you explore how stories shape our connections. Wondering how stories help you network in advance? Looking to bridge online and face-to-face worlds, foster understanding, and ignite innovation? Look no further. Whether you're a leader, communicator, educator, or just love a good story, join us for actionable insights and real talk with professional storytellers, all aimed at helping you build stronger, better connections.
So I wanted to just hop right into it and start off by asking you if you could tell us a little bit about your career trajectory and your interest in storytelling.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here with you, Meg. Happy to join. So I kind of have a different story because I come from a research side. I come from measurement, but storytelling is such a piece of what I do. So to give you a little bit of background, I started in public relations. I went on to my graduate degree in public relations and sparked an interest in the research side of things, the measurement side of things. And the truth is, when I was young, if you asked me what I wanted to do, I would tell you that I wanted to do strategic public relations. And if you define strategic at the end of the day, it really just means research based. So if I wanted to be strategic, if I wanted to tell the right stories that would inspire action or behavior change, then I needed to do research. I needed to understand my audiences. I needed to understand what makes them tick. I need to understand what's working and what's not. And that's really what led me down kind of my media measurement path. And I started off at an organization called Prime Research, where I did media measurement. I was out of New York and worked with several brands, a lot in the automotive industry, consumer sector as well. I spent several years in Brazil. So I did back and forth for a few years, every month or so. I knew the Delta flight attendants quite well, and until I finally moved to Brazil, and I was on site for 2 years with my team there. And it was fantastic where I was able to grow media measurement in this market for my company. I then went on to do some consulting. I worked on the agency side as well. So I've sat at a few public relations agencies. I've had some time at Fleshman Hillard, at Porto Novelli, and then at Lippe Taylor. At Lippe Taylor, a New York-based PR firm, is where I was brought in to develop their measurement practice. So I was brought in to help them measure the impact of the work they were doing and to also help them know how to strategize, right, and to make better decisions in terms of what they're doing for their clients. And then most recently, I moved to Fullintel, where I currently serve as the head of insights. And Fullintel is a media intelligence company that specializes in news monitoring and analysis. So again, I'm back on just the media measurement side, working with brands across the board. And my goal really is to help brands improve business results through data-driven and actionable insights. So that's really the direction I'm coming from. And again, I do something really interesting where I cross over this barrier between academia and the practice of PR. There's so much there that can help us and guide us. So I'm a little bit in both worlds, and I do a lot of research to inform what I do. For example, if I'm creating a measurement metric, I'm always using primary research to test it out, et cetera. So that's how I've kind of ended up in media measurement, and storytelling is a piece of all of that. And we'll talk about that today.
Thank you for that. That is a really helpful context, I think, for listeners to know your background. And I was so excited to have you today because I think a lot of when we talk about storytelling and its impact, measurement is always something that people either avoid talking about or like it's just tricky. You don't hear a lot about that, Angela. So what do you kind of like bringing our kind of moving the conversation forward based on your expertise? What do you think the key pieces are for storytellers when they're thinking about measuring impact? What are things that they should be thinking about or know?
Yeah, great question. Well, first of all, it's not surprising. I chose public relations because I was terrified of numbers, right? I wanted to
Yeah,
be a
that's true.
storyteller. I was fantastic with words. I was a great
Yeah.
writer, and I thought this is a great path for me. And I purposely avoided those statistics classes and those math
Mhm.
classes. So, and I would have told you that I was a storyteller, I was a writer. And
Uh-huh.
that's kind of where I landed in public relations. I thought, great, this is a field I can use my writing, I can use my creativity, and I don't have to do all the math.
I mean, I
Well,
hear that a lot.
right? So
Yeah.
I was one of those. I was one of those who took this path because I was a little terrified of numbers. Funny
Uh-huh.
enough, I ended up on this kind of number side of things, measurement.
Mhm.
So just kind of empathizing with that. I understand that. And it's even
Mhm.
why I chose kind of this public relations route where I was focused on the words and the writing. And, like I said, as I learned about it, really measuring can help us create better content, right? Doing this research. So I have a few studies that I can share today that talk about some things that I've learned that can help to create better content. So when we talk about stories, there's a lot of different formats and mediums, but specifically, I'm looking at news content, right? I'm looking
Mhm.
at the
Mhm.
stories and news that are shaping the perceptions of brands. And when it comes to influencing audiences, which is the goal of our stories, you need to create an awareness that shapes a perception that leads to a behavior, right? This is the goal of public relations, but storytelling is key to all of this. So I've done studies to really, my goal is to figure out how do I measure the impact of news content.
Mhm.
In this work, I also discovered what creates good content. So a few things I could share from one study. I looked at recall factors. So I was looking at what makes someone remember a story when they see it. Because at the end of the day, you could tell the most amazing story, but if no one remembers your brand, it kind of falls flat. You may have done it all in vain. So it's one of those things that I do look at is recall. How are they going to remember your brand when they're exposed to this content? And this could apply to any content.
Mhm.
So I looked at three factors specifically that are in stories. So one is headlines, right? If your brand is in the headline, does that lead to recall? The second was prominence. I looked at how many times a brand is mentioned in content.
Nice.
And the third was visuals, right? Does having a visual, a branded visual make a difference? Does it lead to recall? Now, these might not be the bulk of the story, but they're elements of the news article that
Mhm.
I wanted to look at to see what's going to lead to recall. Well, unsurprisingly, all three of these led to greater recall, right? But what I thought was most interesting is the element that led to the most recall. So if you're looking among the three of these,
Mhm.
I weighted them to see which of the three of these recall factors led to more recall or contributed most to that recall. And in this study, we found that it was visuals. And that's not surprising to us. We're such
Yeah.
a visual society. In fact, when we're telling a story, we're often taking words and trying to create an image, create a visual. And now that we have all of these ways to share content, visual really just ends up at the top. We see it across social media platforms. We see new visual opportunities even on LinkedIn and video sharing. We're seeing this across the board. But what's interesting about it is there was a study maybe 20 years earlier that said headlines was the strongest. So it was something different, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't something that we're used to seeing. So visuals make sense to me because people connect with people, right? And so especially if there's a visual, it kind of creates a more human element in terms of connecting to that. In another study, I found that the type of visual matters. So if you have a human element in your visual, your reader is more likely to engage with that content than if it's just a branded visual without a human element.
I love that. Not surprising, Angela, like you said, but also interesting to see maybe that the attitudes have changed over the years. And another thing I was really interested to talk to you about, given like your career timeline, is how how measurement has changed. So you mentioned like there are so many different platforms. I don't want to date myself, but when I got into journalism, there was you were either a print journalist or a broadcast journalist. There
Oh
was
yeah.
no digital, and I'm not that old. Like I'm still about to be 40, but like, in the prime of my career. So how have you, when you're working with clients or in your research, how do you advise people to begin measuring that impact? I mean, I know they're like that was super helpful. I love the idea of recall, but I think for again, most of us storytellers or us creative types, it can just feel completely overwhelming.
Yeah, that's great. It definitely has changed. Measurement has changed over the years. I definitely started measuring when it was newsprint, and I remember
Mhm.
having all the newsprint on my fingertips, and I was cutting out
Did you
clips,
really?
pasting them in the book, and
Oh,
that's really
wow.
how I started my career. So I
Yeah.
100% understand kind of where we were to where we are.
Mhm.
Now, can you imagine the last time you actually saw newsprint? And I see, I'm like, oh, a relic. That's so cool.
Yeah.
It's not something we're used to seeing. It's not the approach
Mhm.
we're using. And essentially, measurement has changed a lot. But even with all the changes, certain things don't change.
I
And
love
that's
that. Yeah.
and that's actually what's so interesting about the storytelling piece is that the medium is changing, how we're consuming it is changing, everything is changing, but people are still consuming content in some form, and it
Hmm.
can influence how they think and what they do. And so
Hmm.
that part hasn't changed. So I'll tell you from the beginning of my career, we were looking at a lot of traditional media, right?
Hmm.
Your print, your broadcast. When social media shows up, it was a big deal,
Yeah.
right? Whoa, we don't have metrics for social media. And I often say, well, it's the same approach. We're still looking at content and we're looking at people and audiences, and it's kind of the same approach. I will say we've gotten a lot smarter in terms of measurement, but some people are still catching up. So what I would say is like, kind of where we are, there's a lot more AI integration. There's still that human touch. I like to use machines where machines make sense and humans where humans make sense. So that's where I am. I was doing AI work before AI was cool. I've been working with developers and teams in media measurement. But even with all of the advancements in technology, I still rely heavily on my trained human analysts because they can capture things that a machine can't necessarily capture. One example is trust. I measure how likely content is to build trust with audiences. Well, how do I do that? I did research and I actually pulled off of research from academia back in 1995. Mayer et al. Published a study on trust, and they revealed three attributes of trust which no one had ever heard about in the profession, but they're simple. They make sense. It's integrity, it's benevolence, which is more of this purpose work, that doing good work,
Hmm.
and ability, right? How well you do what you do, produce your product. So
Hmm.
these are three attributes of trust that I then went and tested. And I found that actually industry matters. So depending on what industry you're in, you might lean into a different attribute of trust. And your goal matters. Are you trying to drive action? Are you just concerned about sales? Or are you trying to shape a perception of your brand, of your reputation? So, just kind of a side note here, if you're a pharma brand, for example, and you want to create a better brand reputation, then you're going to lean into that purpose work, that benevolence, because
Hmm.
that's what research shows is going to most effectively increase trust. But if you want people to just use your product, you want people to get vaccines, lean into ability. We're good at what we do. There's science, there's research. You don't need to like us, you just need to use the product. So it really depends again on your industry and your goal. But trust again is one of those nuanced
Hmm.
things that humans are analyzing. So, I mean, really basic tips. I would say there's so much out there and there are so many data points. There's not a lack of data. When we
Hmm.
started, just seeing data points was exciting, right? We didn't have all the access that we have now. So my caution usually is it's not that we don't have data. We need to look for the right data points that ladder up to your goals and objectives, right? Looking at your business goal, what is the goal? And laddering up to that with the data points that we're going to measure. And I think that that's a really great place to start. And then when it comes to anything like stories and we're looking at volume, I always say look at a quantity metric with a quality metric.
Hmm.
I've seen brands too often so concerned about quantity of articles, they're not looking at the storytelling and that quality of the article. So we need to look at these together because that storytelling is often what is going to shape perceptions better. So we track key messages, we track topics, we track voices because it's the voices and coverage that's also going to shape the perception more effectively. And that's usually when you're telling the best stories, is when you're bringing in more voices to that storytelling.
I love that. I mean, that's such a great answer in terms of overcoming the overwhelm, right? Like starting with your goals and your objectives, and then kind of like reverse engineering the measurement process based on that. Uh, and I know that brands like over time, like that measurement will change depending on what their campaigns are and stuff like that. But maybe just to break it down a little more, Angela, say you're working on a specific campaign where you're trying to build back trust. Let's just use that as an example. What types of things, what are the nitty-gritty things that you tell people to look at? Like because it just like I struggle, and I think I've heard other people struggle in the profession to where I'm getting at with this is to really communicate the value of the PR or the value of the storytelling, and like if you're talking to like the business types. So yeah, what are the things that you're looking at that give them that like concrete, hey, this is how we know this is working?
Yeah, great question. So I've developed custom metrics to predict how likely content is to influence audiences. For me, that's where I show the value driver, right? So I'm not just saying you're getting this much coverage or it's positive coverage.
Right.
I want to break down all of these factors that will make it more likely for whatever's in this article to influence your audience. I weight them by their impact and I put it into a custom metric. So let me give you a few of these that can give you concrete things that you can use. And just to note here, I say that it predicts how likely it will influence audience. I say that because all of my factors have been tested in a scientific manner. So I've done statistical tests that then I can use the word predict. So I said it's likely to predict, right? If you do
Right.
X, then Y is likely to happen. So a few of these I mentioned already were recall factors, right? So those were those things I talked about: headline, visual, and multiple mentions. In another study I did, I looked at engaged time. And here I pulled out some other things that influence, such as voices, like I talked about. In this study, I found that if you have an influencer who's credible, so I was looking at the skincare industry. So if you have a dermatologist, people were more likely to engage with the content. Then I found that if you had two voices, they're even more likely to engage with the content. I found that the sweet spot is one credible voice and one authentic voice. So
Love
that's
that.
one key takeaway, is looking at not only the story you're telling, but who are the voices you're bringing in to tell that story. And if you have a credible voice, an authentic voice, you're more likely to influence your audiences. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a few others here too.
I love
So
this. Like,
voices-
these examples are helping me wrap my head around this too. So thank you.
Yeah, so voices are obviously one. Sentiment we look at, and then any kind of key topics that are relevant to your brand. So again, talking about that, starting with your goals and objectives. Well, the topics that matter in your story are the topics that are going to create the perception you're looking to create, or that are going to drive the action you're looking to drive. So we look at topics in storytelling. What are the topics that tend to drive more engagement? And maybe even what types of stories. So one of my studies I think will be really relevant for you and for your audiences is we were looking at what types of articles would drive more engagement, right? We wanted to see what type of articles would get eyeballs on them for longer, because the longer that someone interacts with something, the more likely they remember it, the more likely it impacts them. So in this study, we were looking at specifically in the skincare industry, and we looked at 6 different types of articles. So these were things like, is it a sale or promotion? Is it business news, celebrity articles, a roundup where you kind of review different products, an in-depth feature, a review, and how-to or advice articles. So these are some of the article types we were looking at. And in this study, we found that of all these article types, the type that engaged the most was how-to or advice articles.
Yeah.
And I think this really resonates with, yeah, you're not
Yeah.
surprised, it doesn't
Yeah.
seem, with what engages most, because at the end of the day, people don't like friction, right? Like, we don't like to feel like we're being sold to. So that's why those deals, promotions, they actually don't land that well with your audience. What lands well is content that helps me. If you think about your audience, what would they go to Google and search for? What is the question they would type into Google? If your story can answer that question, your audience will engage with that content. So I was looking at skincare in this study. So I was thinking about, what are the questions I Google, right? How to get rid of wrinkles, right? If I find an article that tells me how to get rid of wrinkles, like,
Yeah.
I'm going to read that. That's relevant,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Or how do I get that glowy Meghan Markle skin? Like, whatever it might be, whatever you're going to type into Google and search, that question you're going to ask is what you should be answering with content. How to advice content is what resonates most with people. So when you're telling a story, you need to connect with a person, tell them why this story is good for them. Why does this help them with a question or with a problem that they have? And if you can't do that, you're losing your audience.
Love what you're hearing on this podcast? Consider booking me to speak at your next event. Dive further into the transformative power of storytelling with my keynote. Tell better stories, speak up, stand out, and build community. In a world that often amplifies our differences, my talk invites you to embrace genuine connections. Break free from the echo chambers and discover the art of storytelling. Learn how to share your own narrative, listen actively, and foster communities that flourish on shared experiences. Check out the show notes to learn more about how to book a talk for your next event.
I love that advice. Like, that's such good advice in terms of thinking, like, what would they Google? And then kind of led me to another topic I've kind of heard us circling back around to in this conversation, which is, there's that like the outward, okay, we've done the campaign, let's measure its impact. But then you mentioned earlier, like, it's the research you do before you even come to the story. So I love like this simplistic, like, hey, what are people Googling? Do you have any other tips for people, on the front end of storytelling or creating a campaign? Like, how can we use research and measurement before we even start to have, increase our opportunity to engage with our audiences?
Yes, I mean, you said it so well. I'm often telling people research and measurement isn't something we do at the end, right?
Right.
It's something we do at the beginning. We do it
Yeah.
during, we do it
Right.
after,
Yeah.
right? It is something. So I love that you highlighted that. So there are a lot of ways we can use measurement at the beginning or to guide. And the place I usually like to start is with your audience, right?
Hmm.
You first have to know who is your audience and what is your goal. We talked about goals and objectives already. You start
Yep.
there and they say, well, who's my audience? Who am I trying to influence? So I start by just doing some audience research. And this can be pretty simple. There's ways you can do this with social media to look at, what news outlets is my audience consuming? Who is my audience following? What's important to my audience? And I do a lot of this with just social media, looking at their patterns and behaviors. There are some tools that you can use out there so that can be helpful. Some things are Stat Social or Demographics Pro. These are just tools you can use that are audience tools. There's different ways
Okay.
you can do it if you want to look at some of
Yep.
those. And then after you figure out your audience, again, you can also bring in primary research, do some survey of your audience,
Mm.
right? And see what's important to them. What do they care about? So I start with audience, right? Just figure out who is my audience, what's important to them. That's the first step. And obviously, how am I trying to influence this audience?
Yep.
And another thing we can do is look at, where do I stand in the competitive landscape?
Mm.
Right? So oftentimes when I'm starting with a brand or even doing an RFP process and pitching a new client, I do a landscape media analysis because oftentimes that's what's going to give us the insights is that context that we get through comparison. So now we're looking at other brands that are in the space also trying to communicate. What are they communicating? Right? And thinking about, are there gaps that I'm missing? Right? In terms of, do I think I'm communicating this, but really my competitor is doing it better than me? I've done this for a brand where they had their pillars, right? These are areas
Yep.
of focus. I did a competitive analysis, brand in the tech space, and I went back to them and said, hey, do you know that your competitor is really outperforming you on your sustainability message? Right? Or, like this is your
Mhm.
goal, and you can learn a lot from this brand and what they're doing. So
Yes.
I don't look at competitors as competition. I look at competitors as an opportunity to learn either
Mhm.
where they are doing well, what can I learn from them and copy it, right? Or where are they not doing well? What are the gaps that I can fill in that conversation? So that's one way I look at kind
I
of
love
just
that.
overarching
Mhm.
media competitive analysis. And there's one more thing that I would also say that I use is predictive AI. So we have a tool at Fullintel that's really cool. It essentially predicts how likely an article is to trend. And we
That
have a
is
fun
really
little
cool.
visual. We have
Yeah.
flames. So you have like 1 flame to 5 flames, right?
That's nice.
Five
Yeah.
flames means really likely to trend. It doesn't mean it's
Yeah.
trending already, but it's
Right.
likely to trend. So
Mhm.
this is another thing. And again, there's other tools out there that you could use that could give you trending data. But I
Mhm.
use this to identify whether an article or topic is likely to trend. So when I'm searching for what I might want to write about, I might look at what's trending positively, right? I use that negative to avoid a crisis, right? When I'm
Right.
looking to create positive content, I look
Right.
at what's for me or for my competitors. So I worked with a brand once that made protein products, and we found that there was a really popular product on TikTok that a competitor was doing. And, we put our thing out there, and the next thing you know, our version of it got more hits, more engagement than the competitors, who was the
Love
first
that.
to.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily we're copycatting everything, but you're
Mhm.
learning what people are
Mhm.
engaging with, right?
Mhm.
Part of it is also learning what are the issues that are filling our minds, right? What does your audience care about? And then connecting whatever it is you do to this thing they care about already. So that's kind of some of the ways we can use research, looking at competitors, looking at over time. We can compare to like the previous year. If we're going to do a campaign we do every year and do a year-on-year comparison. So we can know what worked and what didn't work. I've worked with brands who we do this type of analysis to figure out which influencers were more successful in terms of actually getting purchase intent type engagement. And then they're going to invest in those influencers again and leave the others to the side. So it's a really strategic tool to bring in measurement when you're just starting to figure out what is that content we're going to create.
I really love all that advice. It was just like, it was a very nice, like, oh, start here, here, and here. Here's some ways to do that. What do you say to, because I know, like, in my personal experience working with both students and clients, I do see like when campaigns aren't working or, we're not seeing success, I'm hearing like the two things that we've talked about that I hear all the time and see are either your message wasn't clear or you weren't speaking to the right audience. So those are like the two things that we've talked about measuring today. Is there anything else that you feel in that conversation, like a type of measurement that we should really care about, right? Or something that you see clients miss?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that bringing in these pieces, like you're reaching your audience,
Mm-hmm.
right? Your message is there. So I often break it down. I talk about recall. I break it down into
Yeah,
recall,
I love that too.
perception. So
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be your message, your voices, your sentiment. And then I break into audience, which we talked about. And audience, we kind of define in measurement. It can be by media outlet because we know that those outlets reach your audience. It could be
Mm-hmm.
by certain influencers that we know your audience is following.
Mm-hmm.
So I often look at those elements, but I also look at an article being amplified on social media. So maybe it starts in traditional and then it gets amplified on social.
Mm-hmm.
I use that as part of my audience
That's
definition.
nice. Yeah.
And one of the things I would note too with audience is historically, people have leaned heavily on reach numbers or
Yeah.
impressions numbers, right?
Yes.
So big numbers that people
Mm-hmm.
love to report out because
Yep.
they're really big and no one really knows what they mean, right? So
Vanity
that's
metrics, right?
something,
Is that
yes,
what?
vanity metrics, right? And they just keep getting bigger. They never get
Yes.
smaller.
Yeah.
Right. So that's
Yeah.
one of the things that I would maybe put as a caution in terms of how we measure audience,
Mm-hmm.
that if we're just looking at that, you're going to be blindsided
Mm-hmm.
because depending on your brand or what you're trying to communicate, more isn't always better. And those numbers aren't really accurate, or well, they're not accurate at all, right? They're all hypothetical of potential reach. But at the end of the day, who actually reads a full New York Times every day? Right? Like you're
Yeah.
going to read snippets. And
Mm-hmm.
I will actually say, I think people read newsletters more than they're actually reading content. I've done some research in terms of like where people are consuming content. And I have a few hypotheses that there's a lot of social media consumption for news. Some
Mm-hmm.
research shows you that 70% of people consume their media on social.
Yep.
And again, that's going to be your younger audiences.
Yeah.
Yeah, guilty, right? And
Yeah.
then newsletters,
Yeah.
right? I mean, they're old fashioned, but I think they're making a comeback. If you ask me, newsletters are where it's at.
Yeah.
It's something going into your inbox and people are consuming it and they're trusting whatever that source is. It could be an individual, an influencer they follow, right? It's someone that feels more uh, intimate than a big media conglomerate, right?
Yeah.
So you're getting
Uh-huh.
this newsletter from someone you kind of trust,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's another piece that I put into that audience, one thing to think about. And then I also look at behavior predictors. So this is something we haven't really talked about yet,
Yeah.
that I would recommend looking at. And it's a little bit tricky. It depends again on your product and what you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
But something as simple as having a link to purchase or to get more
Yep.
information, we've seen leads to more behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So something as simple as that, and there are some brands where this is really tricky, right? If you're in the pharma space, you might have more restrictions in terms of what you can post in terms of links. If you're in the consumer space, it's super easy, right? Link and make it a trackable link. And
Yep.
then you can quickly see, okay, who is actually engaging through this link? Even a call to action, linking to maybe another news article
Mm.
or a website for more information.
Uh-huh.
It does increase the likelihood that your audience is going to engage. And if they engage in the next step, they get more likely to the click. Now, if it's an easy thing, product, I will tell you, I analyze content for all sorts of brands, but I've done beauty brands and I will read all of this news coverage. At the end of the day, I'm like, wow, I have 20 products in my Amazon cart that I just bought because I'm reading this news coverage. And I'm like, click,
Yeah.
click.
Well,
Oh, it's less than $20. I'm
yeah,
gonna buy that,
yeah.
right? So it's
And
something that's
yeah,
really to think about.
I love that you said that too, because I'm thinking about my own consumer behavior. Is I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, like that article that's like the 20 best hair products, and you're like,
Oh,
oh, that one, that one,
click,
that
click,
one.
click. Yep,
Yeah,
and they have those links right there. It's a great
yes,
way to
so
track
convenient.
behavior.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like leading into my next question. For brands that you've worked with, or any advice you have for teams that are small. So kind of like maybe this is you're the entrepreneur, or you're the one marketing person, or the one PR person. I think measurement, and again, this is just my hypothesis, Angela. I think measurement sometimes falls off the table because it is time consuming, but it's so incredibly important. So do you have any advice for those people who are kind of the one man or the one person show?
Yeah, no, that's great. I can confirm your hypothesis. I've seen this happen. It is just a struggle
Mhm.
when you don't have all of the resources or maybe even the budget to put into measurement, right? I think a few things, there are ways to maybe outsource pieces that can
Nice.
be
Yeah.
cost effective.
Hmm.
That's one thing I would think about. But I would also say if you're going to outsource, be a little bit strategic about it.
Okay.
So there's a way for you to say, okay, I'm going to outsource this just because I know the price is better, it's going to be effective, and this
Hmm.
is what I'm going to use.
Hmm.
Consistency is key. So if you decide to use a metric, like stick with that for a while,
Yeah.
right? Just be consistent over time, or else if you're hopping around all the time to the next thing, you're
Yeah.
going to lose that value. Because one of the
Mhm.
things we get is just that over time data. So that's one thing I would say is like just being consistent over time with whatever you're going to use. But I would also caution you to not uh, get disillusioned by the flashy products you might see. There's always something new, something exciting, but at the end of the day, like I said, it really comes down to those tenets that have always been there, right? So looking at content, right? Just looking at what's out there, looking at content. Survey if you can afford it. You know, if you can't afford a great survey, don't do a survey with a poor panel. I actually don't recommend that. Sometimes we're like, oh, look, this is really cheap. I was like, yeah, it is for a reason.
Yeah.
So, make sure you have the right panel if you are going to do survey. But a lot of times we can use social media to kind of replace some of that in
Hmm.
the in-between phases, right? To get a
Okay.
pulse on what our audience thinks.
Yep.
We can lean on social media listening. So those are some things that I think are very easy, I would say, is just start with something. Start with some basic metrics. Start with some basic measurement. Like I said, one volume metric and even one quality metric. Now, if
Hmm.
you want to get a little bit more smart, do two quality metrics, right? Maybe
Yep.
I'm looking at sentiment and I'm looking at message pull through,
Hmm.
right? Maybe I'm looking at just two things. Maybe I want to add a third one. Now I'm going to look at voices. These are all qualitative metrics. So just
Hmm.
start very basic if that's all you can do. Start with your brand. But sometimes when people don't have budget, they don't look at competitors. In fact, that's one of the first things to go. They'll say,
Hmm.
I don't have a lot of budget, so I'm just going to look at my brand. It kind of puts these blinders on you and you don't see what else is out there. So I recommend if you don't have a lot of budget, still look at competitors, but maybe you look at less competitors. And the other recommendation is maybe look at less media outlets. So if you're doing media measurement, you don't need to measure everything everywhere to understand what's going on. So you might be strategic about it and say, yeah, that's not in the budget for me, but I can pick my 30 top media outlets that I know are resonating the most with my audience. And I will just look at these. We find that if you look at everything everywhere, it actually is the same result percentage wise as maybe those
Oh,
top 30 outlets.
yeah.
Right. So, you're going to see syndications, you're going to see smaller publications. They're not really impacting your audience. So, really thinking about these are my 30 core outlets, and then just focus on those. Don't have budget? Go to 10. Pick one competitor. So, again, thinking about, and I mean budget as time or money, depending if you're
Right.
doing it
Yeah. Thank you.
in-house or outsourcing it.
Hmm.
Either way, you can kind of condense it to create a smaller universe where you're still looking at all the important things and being strategic, but I usually recommend looking at quality, looking at all of the quality metrics in a smaller set than looking at unhelpful automated data that you're not sure if it's correct at everything everywhere. So if you're smaller, just make a smaller universe and work off of that.
Okay, we had to pause the podcast to let you in on this opportunity. If you're ready to elevate your brand storytelling, don't miss our training, Tell Better Stories, led by me, a seasoned television journalist and PR professor, and Kyle, an on-air meteorologist and video storytelling expert. This workshop unveils our secrets to craft compelling, personal-driven narratives that resonate with your audience. Learn our distinct approach that puts people first and brands second, leveraging 6 storytelling elements for maximum impact. Walk away with actionable strategies, tactics, and a clear process to replicate success in any organization. Check out the show notes to learn more about this offer or reach out to homeplacecreative@gmail.com.
I love that advice. And then, kind of maybe build that back out as you kind of get a handle on it. Is there, you say be consistent. Do you have like as a researcher, is there a certain like scope of time or content volume that would give a solid measurement piece? So I think that I've heard different opinions on this, especially when it comes to social media or news circulation. So I'm just curious to hear from you, like, when you say consistent, I'm sure it's different from brand to brand and client to client, but if you could overall, how long should we wait, Angela, or how much volume should we get before we're like, oh, this isn't working, or, oh, that is working, or, yeah.
No, it's a great question. First of all, in terms of like kind of that sample or how much data you're looking at,
Yeah.
obviously the more data we have, the more confident we can
Yes.
be.
And over time, like you said. Yep.
Right. And over time. But I will say that we don't need to look at everything everywhere. I often think about it like just in, research, you define a universe and then you take a sample of that universe. So that's one thing is we don't have to look at everything everywhere, but we can take kind of a sample of that. Not a rule of thumb, but I would say a couple hundred articles is probably enough for me to make any decision.
Oh, wow.
Right. Like it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be thousands.
Okay.
And that might be surprising, but it's only because I've seen it enough that I know that if I see a couple hundred or 1,000, I'm going to see the same thing.
Yeah.
And just from my experience. So I can kind of even say like, oh no, I think this is about what we need to see this. And so consistency is looking at the same sample over time. Because if we're always changing that, then it won't be comparable year on year and over time. And often it's those year on year comparisons that give us the most insights. Because if you think about a brand too, you have seasonal moments, right? So if we're always comparing previous month or previous quarter, it might not be as apples to apples as, Q2 versus Q2 for the previous year, where you have the same seasonal event, right? Or the same campaign. So in terms of volume, again, like, yes, volume is great, but we don't necessarily need it as long as we're looking at all the right places.
Got it.
So yes, more is better, but even if you have a few hundred, it's a good place to start depending on the volume of your brand.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm looking at an Amazon, I'm looking at a Target, like I need a bigger sample, right?
Right.
Because these are brands getting a lot of coverage. But for some of these smaller brands that often the smaller agencies or companies have, you can start with kind of that smaller sample. And then in terms of consistency of metrics, you just want to make sure you're looking at the same thing over time, right? Sometimes people say, oh, well, I got this press release and look at all this pickup, so I want to include that. I'll be like, no, we're not going to include all of that. I'm going to include any of the pickup that came from your important outlets that we've defined.
Yeah, right. The ones that are
Sometimes we get distracted by big numbers that are flashy. And you want to tell your executives, and I tell them at the end of the day, your executives don't want someone who just gives them big numbers. They want someone who's smart, who's going to identify, interpret, and uncover learnings from pitfalls even, right? Like that's what they want at the end of the day. So if you're always just showing them wins, they're going to start doubting what's going on. So you want to show the full picture, the wins, the losses, because you're going to learn from that. And then in terms of like the consistent metrics, again, as I said, pick a few that you can just be consistent with over time. Whether you have a media impact score, which is a conglomerate of various factors, or whether you're just looking at 2 or 3 things. But as long as you're consistent over time and that those things ladder up with your goals, right? If my goal is to be perceived as a sustainable organization, then maybe that's actually my focus. I'm just going to measure any messages around sustainability, right? Because that's what's important to me. And I think that if you can go back and tell that story, then that's actually what's going to help you. Because, I kind of took this full circle here to once you got to tell the story of your data.
Right.
A lot of people miss that step. They end up with data. They've done the research, they've done the measurement, but they still don't put it in a story so that it can be understood and used and applied. So I find that, at the end of the day, if I know the goal, now I'm telling the story around sustainability and how my brand is perceived to be more sustainable than my competitors because of XYZ. And this messaging came across with these audiences, right? So now I have a story that I'm telling around the data. because again, everyone's kind of scared of data alone, and there's so
Yeah.
much data. But how do
Mhm.
you extract now? These are the applicable insights from the data. This is the story that you tell around the data.
Oh, I love that, Angela. That has really brought us full circle,
Full
to
circle.
think. I love it. I love it. But thinking of data, obviously, as researchers, that's always what you're looking at. What are the patterns? What's the story? And what does it mean? And then, like you said, how does that change over time? And I think that for me, I think the most successful brands that I see out there are the ones that are able to really have they know the pulse, right? They know the pulse of their audience, and they're able to grow and kind of pivot and adapt as their community and their audience does. And again, to your point, I think obviously that data and understanding your audience story and your brand story is sort of co-created, I think is a key piece for all brands in the future. So being able to, I think a step for all hopefully like what everybody takes away from this podcast is, if you're in marketing or PR or you have a brand, thinking through what's the story I'm telling and how is it evolving and changing, and how is the data playing a role in
Yeah,
helping people find
absolutely.
that.
And it does change,
Yes.
right? If we're
Yeah.
stuck in old data and we're not getting that pulse on our audience, we might really trip up, right?
Yeah.
Trying to communicate.
Mhm.
One of the areas that we see this nowadays, especially, is around social issues, right?
Yes. Yeah.
There's pressure for brands to speak
Yeah.
out, and it's not unmerited, right? Audiences want
Mhm.
authentic
Mhm.
brands, and they want to trust you, and they want you to speak out on things that are important to them.
Mhm.
But there's this balance for brands about knowing when to speak out, and
Yeah.
how to speak out, what are the
Absolutely.
issues you should engage with. This
Mhm.
is where that comes into play a lot, is kind of knowing that audience and following your audience over time.
Mhm.
So one of our factors of trust I mentioned was benevolence. Well,
Mhm.
the key caveat to that factor is actually it has to be perceived as good for me by your core audience. So sometimes brands think they're being benevolent, right? Where they might be engaging with a social issue that they think is important,
Mhm.
but really it might not resonate with their
Yeah.
audience. And
Mhm.
that can often backfire. Now, the issue is you could have multiple audiences that feel differently on an issue and be very divided.
Yep. Yep.
That's where, brands should probably be a little bit careful. And really, when they engage with an issue, they should engage if it's important to them, it's true to their
Yeah.
values, but
Mhm.
it's also good for their core audience. And
Yes.
if that doesn't come across, it's going to hurt your trust
Mhm.
overall. So
Mhm.
thinking about that, even in content creation or speaking out, like when does it make sense? We always talk about authenticity, right? Of course, your actions
Yeah.
need to line up. You have to come across as authentic when you're doing that. And it will if you're doing the actions,
Yeah.
if you're truly being
Mhm.
authentic.
Mhm.
Audiences are actually really astute to
Mhm.
authenticity.
Yes.
Uh, I think we're really good at now determining, do we trust them or do we not?
I
To
would
the fact
agree.
that sometimes actually being paid might not make a difference to your audience. Thinking about
Right.
influencers now for a minute,
Mhm.
they'll identify paid or sponsored, and there are people who might see that and go, oh, I trust it less because they don't trust the influencer enough. There's
Right.
other ones that be like, I don't care if that's paid. If so and so is talking about it, I
Right.
believe they will
Right.
use this
Yeah.
product,
Yeah.
right? So it's that trust that is built. Same thing with influencers as with brands,
Mhm.
right? So I think that that's one of the areas that brands can be really kind of careful, but also smart about. We do have that expectation to speak out, but again, speaking out in ways that are building trust with your core audience
Yes,
is
absolutely.
going to lead to more success and less backfire.
Right. And that's that again, like you said, that's sort of just using the data, even if it's very simple, like you said, measurements to just get to know your audience better and to serve them, keep serving
Yeah.
them. Right. I love that. Angela, as we wrap up today, is there anything that you were like hoping we talk about today that we didn't get to? Or I loved our conversation. I'm so grateful.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is great. I think we hit on so many things. I would say the only thing that maybe your listeners might be interested in is kind of the future. There's
Yes.
been a lot of conversation around AI.
Yes.
And so maybe I
Yep.
could take a minute to share a
Oh
little bit about
yeah.
what I've been
Love
learning
that.
in this space. And
Hmm.
I talked about earlier kind of where I use human and where I use machine. And I would say,
Yes.
like, I still strongly use humans, but I think some people in the storytelling space are a little concerned about the role of AI.
Yes. Yep.
Either we've heard people say, oh no, this is going to take my job. And other people say, this is fantastic. It just made my life easier. So there's
Hmm.
a lot of mixed emotion around AI. So I just wanted to add a few thoughts here that it's going to get better and better. So where I find gaps right now, I think it will improve. But I would recommend anyone who's using AI, using any of these tools in storytelling or in writing,
Mhm.
is to one, think about, um, questioning the model. First of all, that sometimes we take things and just take it at face value and don't ask questions.
Mhm.
So please ask questions. If you're consuming data or measurement that's been automated, generated with automation, right? Ask questions. What was the model? What was it trained on? What is the bias that might exist here?
Mm.
And really
Yeah.
thinking about that, because there are issues, there is bias. So really asking questions when you consume information can be really helpful and help us avoid, consuming or we're spreading misinformation or disinformation.
Mhm.
So, I invite everyone to, ask questions when you consume content. And then the other thing is, thinking about what are the ethics around AI use. And
Mhm.
I'll just put out there that, some people, some organizations have made guidelines for when you do use AI in your writing of disclosure.
Mhm.
So it's something we're seeing more. The Institute for Public Relations, the Public Relations Society of America, these are some of the groups I'm involved with in leadership roles, and they're posting guidelines around the use of AI. It's something that we should lean into because if we are ethical at the onset, it can avoid shutdown with legal implications in the future. So it can be something I think that thinking about how am I ethically using this? How am I disclosing when it's necessary? And how am I questioning my sources of data as I'm writing can help us be better sharers and consumers of the stories we want to keep telling.
Mhm.
So that's one thing that I think can be really helpful to kind of bring up as well, because we're also interested in how do I use AI and where is it going?
I love that. Thank you, Angela, for that advice. And one thing that we've heard from other guests too about AI, which I think is relevant here too, is that can also feel overwhelming in some of the same ways that like data and measurement is, especially I think for just for everybody, but especially for our listeners who are in communications. So just get involved. Like you mentioned, you're in leadership roles, but PRSA has all of these organizations, or maybe a local organization, like you said, ask questions and think about I know AI's been around for obviously a long time, but it's been in the public eye, fairly recently in the past year, it seems like a lot. So yeah, asking questions and understanding where we're at. And hopefully, I think you said if you're a leader of an organization or in a leadership position, thinking through the ethics of what that's going to look like in the future for all of us. So great advice. Thank you so
Yeah,
much. So
cool.
we always wrap up with a rapid fire question round. There's three questions. So and they're fun. Hopefully, Angela. Um, what is your first one
No
is
pressure.
yeah, no, these are fun. What is your favorite story of all time? So it could be like a movie, a book, song, any format, poem. Yeah,
Oh, that's a
favorite
great
one.
question. Yeah, my favorite story of all time. Oh, there's just so many I gotta think.
I
I mean,
know.
it's gotta be a love story, right? I'm like,
I love that. You're like,
gotta be a love story.
yeah,
I think that honestly, I mean, probably my favorite story is anything that empowers women, to be honest.
I
Like,
love
I think
that.
about Eleanor Roosevelt. I love like
Mhm.
her story. I had a night
Yeah.
the other night where I invited women in the neighborhood. It's my ladies in legislation group. We made a little
Oh,
mug
I
in
love
honor of
that. Ladies in
uh,
legislation.
ladies
Angela.
in legislation. There was just grassroots women getting together, talking, educating. And I made one called Eleanor's Elixir after Eleanor
Love.
Roosevelt.
Oh, I love all
And
of this.
I think she's one of these women I like to tell her story because I think she was kind of like, get in there, get your hands
Yeah.
dirty. So like a woman with substance. And I
Hmm.
love any story that empowers women of next generation. So kind of an old story. I'd love to have a chat with her one day.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Like, also, she was so forward for her time, right? Just these
Exactly.
women
Yeah,
that
like,
were like pushing the boundaries and expanding what was possible. Yeah, before their time. Florence Nightingale is another one. If
oh,
you like, I
yes.
love her story.
Yes.
Like, oh,
Just women
love
who
that.
push the boundaries for their era
Yes.
and hoping that
Yep.
inspires women today to do
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
and tell those stories. So those would
Yeah.
be my favorite stories.
Ooh, thank you. I love that. And then the second question is a piece of storytelling advice that you heard. You could do either or. that's so great you just want everyone to know, or so terrible you want to warn everybody about it?
Oh, that's great. I think that for me, at the end of the day, and I mentioned this, it's all about authenticity. So when
Mhm.
you're telling a story, the best advice, that I would hear is just to make it authentic, that it really connects, that it's very genuine when you're telling this story. And I mean, it's kind of a big one, but I just think
No, I love
lean
that.
into authenticity because the fails I have typically seen is when you're telling a story, but your heart isn't there. It's not
Yeah.
authentic. It's not lined with your passion.
Yeah, no, that's another really good piece of advice. When we work with people too in video storytelling, we always say, we just want you to be comfortable enough that you're yourself. We don't want you to feel like you're overperforming or trying to be super scripted. Because as you said earlier, audiences really do our perceptions of trust. It really matters on and that authenticity. So another great piece of advice. Thank you. And then the last one is, how do you define storytelling in your own words?
In my words.
Mhm.
Well, storytelling for me, since again, coming from the public relations space and measurement, it's how we tell what we need to say to create an awareness that drives that perception that leads to behavior. So it's that story, it brings to life that thing that will drive behavior. So
Mm.
it's something that essentially takes an idea and gives it human aspect or a human element.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. That's again a full picture from where we've been in this conversation to the way that you think about it. I love that definition. And then finally, before we go, Angela, where can people find you, or how can they work with you,
Yeah,
connect with you? Yeah.
great, perfect. You can go to fullintel.com, Fullintel.com. If you're looking for any way to connect with measurement, insights, monitoring, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn, please follow me on LinkedIn as well. Love to connect there.
Thanks so much, Angela, and thanks so much for your time today. I feel like I want to, as I edit this episode, I will be taking notes. Like there's so many, like I need to
You're
stop and pause.
amazing. Well, this was such a fun
Yeah.
conversation. Thanks for
Thank you.
inviting me.
Yeah. Thanks.
We're so glad you've listened to this podcast episode. If you liked it, would you mind doing us a favor? Share this episode with someone who would be interested in the topic too. We're on a mission to help everyone become a better storyteller. And don't forget to subscribe to the show to get updated every time we release a new episode. Each and every episode is produced, hosted, and edited by us, Meg and Kyle Adams at Home Place Creative. Happy storytelling!